The clink of silver on bone china was the metronome of Avery's life. It was a sound of order, of quiet wealth and unspoken rules. At 23, she moved through the hushed, velvet-draped dining room of Orion with an economy of motion that bordered on art. She was a ghost in a crisp black apron, refilling water glasses, clearing plates, and delivering $500 entrees with a smile that was professional, polite, and revealed absolutely nothing. Competence was her armor. She was good at her job, a fact that provided a small, hard kernel of satisfaction in a life that often felt like it was being lived on a treadmill. Tonight, the air was different. It had shifted the moment he walked in. He wasn't loud or ostentatious. In fact, his entrance was marked by a profound lack of sound. The low hum of conversation simply dipped, as if the room itself held its breath. Avery, clearing a table near the entrance, felt it first as a change in pressure, a sudden cold spot in the warm, food-scented air. She looked up from stacking plates. He was flanked by two other men, but they were just background noise, blurred shapes in the periphery. Her eyes locked on the man in the center. He wore a Tom Ford suit the color of a midnight sky, tailored so precisely it seemed less like clothing and more like a second skin. His posture was absolute, a straight, unyielding line of authority. But it was his stillness that was the most unsettling. He moved like the room owed him space, and the room seemed to agree, parting for him as if he exerted his own gravitational pull. Her manager, a perpetually flustered man named Julian, scurried over, his face a mask of anxious hospitality. "Mr. Kwon, welcome. Your usual table is ready." Kwon Min-jun said nothing. His gaze swept the room once, cold and analytical, cataloging everything and dismissing it just as quickly. There was a thin, white scar that bisected his left eyebrow, the only flaw on a face that was otherwise unnervingly perfect, carved from stone and shadows. He let Julian lead him to the best table in the house, a secluded booth overlooking the city lights. Avery went back to her work, trying to shake the chill that had settled in her bones. She'd seen rich men, powerful men. But this was different. This was predatory. 10 minutes later, she saw the reason for her unease. A younger waitress, Sarah, approached his table, her hands trembling slightly as she held her notepad. Avery watched from across the room. She couldn't hear the words, but she saw the exchange. Min-jun said something short, his voice too low to carry. Sarah flinched as if struck. He then made a small, dismissive gesture with his hand, a flick of the wrist that said "You are nothing." Sarah turned, her face pale, and hurried back towards the kitchens, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Something inside Avery, a stubborn, unshakable sense of right and wrong, snapped into place. She had seen managers bully staff, seen entitled customers treat them like furniture. She hated it, but she endured it. This, however, was a different kind of cruelty. It was casual, absolute, and dehumanizing. Julian intercepted Sarah, hissing at her before his face smoothed back into a pained smile. He looked around for another server, his eyes pleading. They landed on Avery. She gave a subtle shake of her head. Julian's expression hardened. He gestured for her to come over. "Avery, table 12, he said, his voice tight. "Just take his order. Don't make a scene." "He just made Sarah cry," Avery said, her own voice low and steady. "He's our most important client. Do it." Avery took a deep breath. She walked towards the table, not with a notepad, but with her hands empty at her sides. The two men with Min-jun tensed as she approached, their eyes like chips of ice. Min-jun himself did not look up from the menu he was pretending to read. He knew she was there. He was making her wait. She stood in silence. The seconds stretched into a minute. The quiet pressure was a tactic, she knew, meant to unnerve and establish dominance. Finally, he lifted his head, and his dark, empty eyes met hers. They were intelligent, she noted with a detached part of her brain, and completely devoid of warmth. "Are you ready to order, sir?" she asked. Her tone was perfectly level, betraying none of the fury coiling in her gut. He set the menu down, the corner of his mouth ticking up in a smirk that was not a smile. I had a request. I asked that my server not be incompetent. The last one failed. Are you going to be a problem as well? The insult was delivered like a surgeon's scalpel, precise, cold, and intended to cut deep. That was it. The line. Avery's professionalism was a shield, but it wasn't unbreakable. She would not be a party to this. She would not serve this man. Yes, she said, her voice clear and carrying in the now silent dining room. I am.
Minunes miak.
His eyes narrowed slightly. He had expected fear, or at least fawning compliance. He had not expected this. Avery stood a little straighter. We pride ourselves on a certain standard of service here, sir. But we also expect a certain standard of decorum from our guests. You have failed to meet that standard. You were rude and demeaning to my colleague for no reason. Julian was making frantic gestures from across the room, his face ashen. The two bodyguards began to rise from their seats. Minjun held up a single, elegant hand. They froze. His entire focus was on her. The air crackled with a tension so thick she could taste it, metallic and sharp. I am not serving you, Avery continued, her heart hammering against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. But her voice did not waver. In fact, I am asking you to leave. A gasp rippled through the nearby tables. Julian looked like he was about to faint. To ask a customer to leave was unheard of. To ask Kwon Min-jun to leave was suicide. He stared at her for a long, unbearable moment. She could feel his gaze stripping her down, analyzing her, filing her away. He wasn't angry. He was intrigued. It was worse than anger. It was the look of a collector who had just found a rare, defiant specimen. Without another word, he stood. He adjusted the cuffs of his suit, a deliberate, unhurried motion. He dropped a black credit card on the table. For the girl's trouble, he said, his voice a silken threat. Then he turned and walked out, his men falling in behind him like shadows. The moment the door closed, the room erupted in whispers. Julian rushed over, his hands shaking with rage and terror. Are you insane? Do you have any idea who that was? I don't care who he was, Avery said, the adrenaline starting to fade, leaving a cold dread in its wake. You're fired, Avery. Fired. Get your things and get out. I hope you know what you've just done.
She did.
And she didn't. She had stood up for what was right. But as she walked out of the restaurant and into the cool night air, she couldn't shake the feeling of his eyes on her. It felt like she had been marked. The next morning, the feeling became a certainty. She woke up late, the emotional exhaustion of the previous night weighing on her like a physical blanket. She made coffee, trying to figure out her next move.
Find a new job.
Pay rent. Life's relentless machinery. She glanced out her third-floor apartment window, looking down at the quiet residential street. It wasn't quiet anymore. Lined up along both sides of the street, engines off, were 10 identical black SUVs. They were polished to a mirror shine, their tinted windows reflecting the morning sun like the compound eyes of some enormous, predatory insect. They blocked the entire street, a silent, immovable barricade. People on the sidewalk hurried past, heads down, refusing to look. Avery's blood ran cold. This wasn't about getting her fired. This was something else. This was a message, a display of power so absolute it was suffocating. Her phone buzzed on the counter. An unknown number. She stared at it, her hand shaking. With a sense of grim inevitability, she answered. There was silence for a moment, then a voice she recognized from the night before. It was low, calm, and held the chilling promise of endless, patient violence. Avery, Kwon Min-jun said, not as a question, but as a statement of ownership. I believe we have some unfinished business. The door of the lead SUV opened. A man in a dark suit stepped out, looked directly up at her window, and waited. There was nowhere to run. The ride was silent. Avery sat in the back of the SUV, surrounded by the scent of expensive leather and Min-jun's cologne, cedar and smoke, which seemed to linger in the air of any space he occupied. The windows were so heavily tinted that the world outside was just a muted blur of gray and brown. It felt like being sealed in a very luxurious tomb. The man beside her, the same one who had waited on the street, said nothing. His hands rested on his knees, perfectly still. The silence was a weapon, designed to fray her nerves, to make her imagine all the terrible possibilities. Avery focused on her breathing. In, out. A steady rhythm. She would not give them the satisfaction of her fear. They drove for 20 minutes, ending up in the city's most exclusive district. The SUV descended into a private underground garage and stopped before a private elevator. She was escorted up, the ride smooth and dizzyingly fast. The doors opened directly into a penthouse that was less a home and more a monument to wealth and power. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a panoramic, God's-eye view of the entire city. The furniture was sparse, modern, and brutally expensive. Grays, blacks, and whites dominated the space, a sterile landscape of marble, steel, and glass. And there he was. Kwon Min-jun stood by the window, hands in the pockets of his perfectly tailored trousers, looking out at the city as if he owned it. He probably did. He turned as she entered, his expression unreadable. "Leave us," he said to his men. They bowed slightly and retreated, the elevator doors closing with a soft, final hiss. They were alone. "You had me fired," Avery said. It wasn't an accusation, just a fact. She needed to start this conversation on her own terms, however flimsy they were. "That was a consequence of your actions," he replied, his voice calm. "Julian was foolish to hire someone with such a reckless sense of principle. But that is his problem. You're now mine." He walked towards her, his movements fluid and deliberate. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. "Last night, you created a spectacle. In my world, spectacles attract attention. Attention is dangerous. You made me look weak, as if I could be dismissed by a waitress." "You were being a bully," she shot back, her anger overriding her fear. "I don't care what world you're from. Common decency shouldn't be a foreign concept." A flicker of something, surprise? Amusement, crossed his face before it was gone. "Decency is a luxury. Control is a necessity. You lack control, Avery. You act on emotion. It's a flaw that can get people killed." His words hung in the air, heavy with a meaning she didn't understand. He turned and walked back to the window. "5 years ago," he began, his voice taking on a different tone, one layered with the frost of old grief, "I was in a position not unlike last night. A negotiation with a rival. He insulted me. I allowed my anger to show. We argued, loudly, in a public place." He paused, his jaw tightening. It was a momentary loss of control.
A spectacle.
Avery remained silent, listening. They saw it as a weakness, an opening. They decided to send me a message, to remind me that I was vulnerable. They didn't come for me. They went for the person I had failed to shield. He looked at her then, and for the first time, she saw a crack in the cold facade. She saw a wound. Her name was Jesse. She was my fiancée. They killed her because I lost my temper over a business deal. They killed her to prove a point. The sterile room suddenly felt airless. This wasn't just a story, it was a confession, a warning. He was drawing a direct line from his past tragedy to her present defiance. "Your little show of principle last night," he continued, his voice once again hard as steel, "it put you on the radar of my enemies. The Choi family saw what happened. They see you. And they're wondering if you're my new Jisoo, my new weakness." Before Avery could process the horrifying implication, it happened. A sharp crack, like a giant whip, echoed through the penthouse. The window beside Min-jun exploded inward, a spiderweb of cracks erupting from a single, neat hole before shattering into 1,000 pieces. Instinct took over. Min-jun moved faster than she thought possible. He crossed the space between them in a single stride, tackling her to the floor. His body was a hard, unyielding shield over hers as shards of glass rained down around them. The sharp scent of ozone from the bullet's passage filled the air. Her face was pressed against the cold silk of his shirt, her ear to his chest, where his heart beat a steady, controlled rhythm, entirely at odds with the chaos he had just pulled her into. The elevator dinged and his men flooded the room, guns drawn, shouting in Korean. One of them rushed toward her, yelling something about a secure exit, an escape route, a chance to run. But as Min-jun started to rise, pulling her with him, Avery's eyes caught a flicker of movement near the shattered window. It wasn't one of his men. It was another figure, dressed in black, who had used the sniper's shot as a diversion to slip in from the balcony. He was moving towards Min-jun's unprotected back, a long, thin knife in his hand. There was no time to think. Her escape, his men, the broken glass, it all faded away. There was only the immediate, certain threat.
Min-yun, she screamed.
Her voice, sharp with terror, cut through the noise. He whipped around, his eyes instantly finding the threat she had seen. The fight was over in seconds. It was not a brawl, it was a brutal piece of choreography. A block, a twist, a sickening crack of bone. The would-be assassin crumpled to the floor. Silence descended once more, broken only by the sound of their breathing and the wind whistling through the broken window. Min-jun stood over the downed man, his chest rising and falling. His men had secured the room, their focus entirely on him, awaiting orders. But he wasn't looking at them. He was looking at her. He walked over to where she stood frozen, her heart pounding. He stopped in front of her, his gaze intense, searching. He had been a breath away from death, and she had been his only warning. She had had a clear path to run, to save herself, and she had stayed. She had chosen to scream his name. Avery, he said, and the way he spoke her name was different now. It was no longer a statement of ownership. It was something else. Something quieter, more complex. It was the sound of a carefully constructed wall developing its first, undeniable crack. "You cannot leave," Min-jun stated, his voice flat and absolute. They stood in the wreckage of his living room, the wind a cold reminder of how close death had come. "It is no longer a matter of my reputation. The Choi family believes you are a vulnerability. As long as they think that, your life is in my hands." It wasn't a choice. It was a prison sentence delivered in a calm, rational tone. Avery was now a permanent resident of his gilded cage, a pawn in a war she hadn't known existed. The days that followed blurred into a monotonous cycle of luxurious confinement. She had a suite of rooms with a view that other people paid millions for, a wardrobe of clothes that appeared magically in her closet, and food prepared by a private chef. But every door was locked, and a silent guard was always posted outside her own. Min-jun was a ghost. He would be there for hours, working in his office, the sound of his low, intense phone calls in Korean a constant background hum. Then he would be gone for a day, leaving only the lingering scent of his cologne. In the moments they were in the same room, the silence was a living thing, charged with the memory of the attack, of his body shielding hers, of her scream that had saved his life. He watched her. She felt his eyes on her when she was reading or staring out at the city, a restless energy building inside her. The choice were not idle. They tested the security of the building twice in the first week. Small probing attacks. A hacked fire alarm. A car that followed one of his supply deliveries. Min-jun's response was swift and brutal. She didn't see it, but she heard the aftermath in his clipped, cold orders over the phone. He was dismantling their operations, piece by piece. The third attempt was different. It was personal. Min-jun had to move her. He said the penthouse was compromised. The plan was a quiet relocation in the dead of night. They took a service elevator to the garage. It was supposed to be secure. It wasn't. As their armored car rounded a concrete pillar, two other vehicles slammed into them, pinning them in a screech of tortured metal. The world became a cacophony of gunfire and shattering glass. Min-jun threw himself over her again, but this time it was different. It was frantic, less controlled. The bullets thudded against the car's armor like angry fists. His men were returning fire, but they were outnumbered. A door was wrenched open, and a man with the face of a snarling dog grabbed Avery, dragging her out into the chaos of a garage. The air was thick with gunpowder and the smell of burning rubber. He pressed the cold muzzle of a gun to her temple. "Kwan," the man shouted, his voice raw. Call off your dogs, or your new pet dies. Avery's entire world narrowed to the circle of steel against her skin. She looked past her captor and saw Minjun. He was crouched behind the car, a gun in his hand, but his movements were frozen. His face, usually a mask of cold composure, was stark white.
She saw it then.
The raw, unadulterated fear. He was seeing Jisoo. He was living his nightmare all over again. And in his hesitation, she saw her chance. He was frozen, but she was not. Her mind raced, fueled by pure adrenaline. She did the only thing she could think of. She bit down, hard, on the hand that was clamped over her mouth. The man roared in pain, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was enough. Avery dropped, tucking her body into a ball and rolling away as a gunshot exploded where her head had just been. Minjun had taken the shot. The moment her captor had flinched, Minjun's paralysis had broken, replaced by a lethal focus. The firefight was over almost as quickly as it began.
Minjones men uroligelig efficient.
When the silence returned, he was at her side, pulling her to her feet, his hands checking her for injuries with a frantic energy that terrified her more than the gun had. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice rough. She shook her head, unable to speak. He pulled her against him, a harsh, desperate embrace that lasted only a moment before he pushed her toward another car, his face once again a cold, hard mask. But she had seen it. She had seen the terror in his eyes at the thought of losing her. They ended up in an industrial warehouse converted into a grim, functional safe house. One of the Choi soldiers had been captured alive. Minjun needed to know who had leaked their route. The man was defiant, spitting curses.
Minjones festokkend.
Avery knew what was coming next. The interrogation would be brutal. She watched as Minjun's top lieutenant prepared a set of tools that made her stomach turn. She couldn't just stand by. She had to do something. She remembered the man's face. She had seen him before. At the restaurant, the night she had confronted Minjun. He had been sitting at the bar, watching. "Stop," she said, her voice surprisingly strong. Minjun turned to her, his expression dangerous. "This does not concern you." "He was at Orion that night," she said, walking toward the captive, who sneered at her. He was watching for his boss. She focused on the man, her mind racing, inventing a story from thin air. "Your boss, Choi Young-soo. He's already made a deal. He gave you up in exchange for a ceasefire." The man laughed. "You're lying." "Am I?" Avery leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "He told Mr. Kwon about the mole in his own organization. The one who drives a gray sedan. The one with the debt to the Russians. He gave up everything. And he gave you up to seal the deal. You were the sacrifice." She was making it all up, weaving details she couldn't possibly know into a tapestry of betrayal. She saw the flicker of doubt in the man's eyes. The choice were ruthless. Betrayal was their native language. It was plausible. The man's bravado began to crumble. "He wouldn't." "He already did," Avery said, her voice cold as ice. "You're all that's left. You can die for a man who already sold you, or you can tell us who the mole is and live." The man broke. He started talking, spilling names and locations, his words tumbling out in a desperate flood. Avery stepped back, a wave of nausea washing over her. She had just manipulated a man with a lie, pushing him into betraying his own. She had crossed a line. She was no longer just a waitress dragged into this world. She was a participant. Later that night, after the mole had been dealt with and the immediate threat neutralized, Minjun found her staring at the grimy window of the safe house. "You lied with a calm I have not seen in my most experienced men," he said from behind her. His voice wasn't angry. It held a note of something that sounded like awe. She turned to face him. "I did what I had to do to survive." He stepped closer, invading her space, the scent of him, cedar, smoke, and danger, enveloping her. "I brought you into my world to control a problem," he murmured, his voice so low she could feel it vibrating in her chest. His dark eyes searched hers, the mask of command stripped away, leaving something raw and honest in its place. "Now, Your presence is the only thing that feels certain. He wasn't talking about control anymore. He was talking about the chaos she had brought into his life, and how, terrifyingly, it was starting to feel more real than the cold, ordered world he had built around himself. It was a confession, more dangerous and intimate than any declaration of love. It was an admission that she, the waitress who had defied him, was now the one thing he couldn't afford to lose. The information Avery had extracted was a roadmap to the heart of the Choi family's power. It pointed to a private gathering at a secluded estate, a meeting of all their key players. It was the perfect opportunity for Min-jun to strike, to end the war in a single, decisive blow. The plan was surgical. He would take his best men, infiltrate the estate, and eliminate Choi Young-soo. As his team prepared, an uneasy feeling coiled in Avery's stomach.
It was too easy.
The captured soldier had broken too completely. She replayed her lie, her fabricated story of betrayal. It had been convincing, yes, but what if the information he gave up was also a lie? What if her cleverness had been used against them? The target isn't you at the estate, she said, bursting into Min-jun's temporary office where he was looking over blueprints. It's me. Here. He looked up from the plans, his gaze sharp. Explain. It's a trap, she insisted, her words tumbling out. They let you capture him. They knew you'd get the information. They're counting on you taking all your best soldiers, leaving this place with minimal protection. They aren't waiting for you there. They're coming here for me, to take your weakness while you're gone. His jaw tightened. He saw the logic in it instantly. It was exactly the kind of move he would make. He looked from her to the blueprints, then back. The war had shifted. The battlefield was no longer some distant estate. It was here. You're right, he said, his voice grim. He picked up his phone, but before he could make the call to abort the mission, the lights in the warehouse flickered and died, plunging them into emergency backup lighting that cast long, distorted shadows. The power had been cut. At the same time, the distinct sound of vehicles arriving outside echoed through the cavernous space. They were too late. The enemy was at the gates. Min-jun's face was a mask of cold fury. He had left only a skeleton crew of 4 men to guard the safe house. Not enough. Go, he ordered one of his men. Take her to the panic room in the basement. But Avery shook her head.
No.
They'll expect that. They'll go there first. She knew this place now, had paced its floors for days. She knew its layout, its quirks. We have to separate them. Confuse them. Before he could argue, she ran to the warehouse's main control panel. She slammed her hand on the fire alarm, and a deafening klaxon began to blare, accompanied by flashing strobe lights. It was disorienting, chaotic.
It was a start.
The loading bay, she yelled to Min-jun over the noise. There are stacks of old shipping crates. We can use them for cover. She didn't wait for his approval. She ran, trusting he and his men would follow. She wasn't a soldier, but she had a survivor's instinct. Hiding was a death sentence. They had to use the environment itself as a weapon. The next few minutes were a blur of terror and adrenaline. Gunfire erupted as the Choi assassins breached the building. Avery scrambled behind a mountain of wooden crates, Min-jun right beside her, his gun barking in the gloom. He moved with a deadly grace, a phantom in the strobing lights, but there were too many of them. She saw 2 of his men go down. They were being cornered. Looking around frantically, Avery spotted a heavy chain hoist hanging from a steel girder above a narrow passage the Choi men were using to advance. On the wall was the control box. While Min-jun lay down covering fire, she scurried to the controls, her hands fumbling with the buttons. She hit the release. With a deafening crash, a ton of steel chain and hook dropped from the ceiling, completely blocking the passage and crushing one of the assassins beneath it. The move bought them precious seconds. But the leader of the hit squad, a hulking man with a cruel face, had broken through from the other side. He cornered her against a wall, the last of Min-jun's men lying motionless nearby. Min-jun was pinned down, too far away to help. The assassin grinned, raising his weapon. This was it. Avery scanned her surroundings, her eyes landing on a heavy, iron fire extinguisher mounted on the wall. She wasn't waiting to be rescued. As the man took a step toward her, distracted for a split second by Min-jun's renewed firing, she ripped the extinguisher from its mount. It was heavier than she expected, but her fear gave her strength. She swung it with all her might, smashing it into the side of the man's head. The impact was jarring, sending a shockwave up her arms. He staggered back, stunned, a look of disbelief on his face. It was the only opening Min-jun needed. 2 shots, clean and precise, echoed in the warehouse. The assassin crumpled to the ground. And then, silence. The klaxon died. The emergency lights hummed. The air was thick with the metallic tang of blood. It was over. Min-jun walked toward her, his gun still held at the ready. He swept the room with his eyes, ensuring there were no more threats before his gaze finally settled on her. He holstered his weapon and came to a stop in front of her, his expression stripped bare of everything but relief and something that looked terrifyingly like reverence. His hands came up, not to grab or pull her, but to gently frame her face. His thumbs brushed over her cheekbones, checking for injuries. His touch was surprisingly soft. "They thought you were my weakness," he said, his voice rough with the aftermath of battle. A liability to be exploited. He looked into her eyes, and the entire dark, violent world he commanded seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of them in the echoing silence. "They were wrong. You are the only part of this empire I will not risk." It was not a promise of safety.
It was a vow.
An acknowledgement of what she had become to him. Not a pawn, not a prisoner, but the center of his world. The victory was not clean. He had lost men, good men, a cost that was etched onto his face. The war with the choice was over, but the price had been paid in blood. Days later, they were back in the penthouse. The broken window was replaced, the scars of the attack erased by money and manpower. The city glittered below, a sea of indifferent lights. Avery stood by the window, wearing a simple black dress that had appeared in her closet. She felt its silk against her skin and understood it was not a uniform, but a choice. He came to stand beside her. He didn't touch her, but his presence was a solid, warm weight in the vast, empty room. The silence between them was different now. It was not the tense, hostile quiet of a captor and his prisoner. It was a shared space, a territory they now occupied together. He would never ask her to stay. He wouldn't need to. The question was already answered. She had answered it in the warehouse, with a fire alarm and a swinging extinguisher. She had answered it when she chose to lie to save him. She looked at her reflection in the glass, a woman she barely recognized, and then at his, the unyielding man standing beside her. Turning her head slightly, her voice was quiet but clear in the still room. "What happens now?" He didn't look at her. He looked out at the sprawling city, at the kingdom he had built on violence and control. His hand finally moved, his fingers closing over hers where they rested on the window ledge. The grip was firm, possessive, and yet unmistakably protective. "Now," he said, his voice a low promise against the backdrop of the skyline. "We begin."